In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. The parable that we hear this morning is the only time that Jesus names one of the characters in the parable. The story of the rich man and Lazarus, the poor man who sits at the gates and is passed by regularly and doesn't even receive the crumbs from Lazarus' table. From the rich man's table. This parable is set within the chapter in Luke where Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and he just before this has said to him, reminded and told and taught them that you cannot serve two masters. No one can serve God and mammon. The story isn't there to tell us that we have to be poor to enter the kingdom of heaven, though it might be easier to do so in that way. There have been plenty of wealthy patrons of the church, wealthy parishioners, wealthy saints even, who don't allow the money in their lives to control them or to draw them away from God. And yet that was not the case in the parable that Jesus told. Rather, this rich man in his wealth lived eating well, dressing well, living high, and yet when he saw one who was in need, one whose name he even knew, one who he passed by daily, he couldn't even give him the crumbs from his table. We have a tendency, I think, to want to isolate ourselves from those around us. We have a tendency to think that we can compartmentalize our faith into what we do on Sunday or what we do before our prayer, in our prayer corner, before our icons. Compartmentalize what we do even with each other and with those that we know and we love, separated from everything else we do in life. Separated from those that we work with and those that we see and those who are our neighbors. Separated even sometimes from what we do in our own house, at our kitchen table, in our bedrooms, wherever else. Separate our faith and how we live it from those around us that we see in the mall, on the street corner, and everywhere that we go. And yet, our faith and our God calls us not to isolate ourselves and our circumstances, but rather to recognize that we live in communion with all those around us. We live in communion with our neighbors, with our family, with our friends, with our enemies. We live in communion with those that we see at the mall and on the street corner and in the cars next to us as well. We live in communion with them as we live in communion with God. And so as we desire to be closer to God, we must also learn to be closer to them. The gospel that we just heard shows us a picture of one who wanted to live isolated from those around him. To live as if those other parts of his life didn't matter in the same way. And yet, we are called to live very differently than that. To see our brother around us, and this is really an age-old problem, isn't it? Because with Cain and Abel, Cain came back and said, "Who am I, my brother? Am I my brother's keeper?" Hoping that the answer would be no. But of course, realizing the answer to him and to each of us, that the answer is yes. We are indeed our brother's keeper. We live not in isolation from the rest of the world or those around us, but rather called to live in communion with those around us, to help those who are in need. And Jesus reminds us that not just in the parable today, but throughout the Gospels. Reminds us that in particular, those who are hungry, those who are thirsty, those who are poor, those who are without homes, those who are sick and in prison. Those are they through whom we see God, and with whom we have communion with God. So let us not live in isolation from those around us, but rather, as we go out, let us think who is and who are the Lazaruses in our life. This parable, again, names the person in the parable. The people around us are not nameless. The poor in our midst, in our neighborhoods, on our street corners, in our malls, are not nameless. But let us recognize in each one of them the Lazarus of whom we heard in this morning's gospel. And rather than being like the rich man who passes by him every day, let us at least give those around us the crumbs from our table, that we might help those who are in need, that we might give to those who have not. Reminds me, one last thing, reminds me of a story of a piece from C.S. Lewis, who was talking with a friend, and was walking with a friend, should I say, in the streets, and gave some money, some spare change, let's call it, right, to a poor beggar on the street. And his friend saw him do this and said, "Why did you give this money to him, right? You know, he's just going to go and buy ale with it," right? This is in England, earlier in the 20th century, mid-20th century. Well, he's just going to go and buy ale with it. So C.S. Lewis thought about it and said, obviously I'm paraphrasing here, but said, yes, but I would go and do the same thing with it. And how true that is. As we pass by those who are in need and don't give to them, thinking, well, they're going to go do something that they shouldn't do with it. And yet, how often we are doing that same something with it instead. So let us reflect on this parable every day, and as we see those in need, give to them, that we might know the kingdom of heaven that is among us, and that is within us, and that we might show the love of God to all those around us, that they might know Him as well. That we might together give glory to Him, to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and to ages of ages.